I think the Epstein disaster has only just begun. I don't think it's nearing an end. I think it's going to metastasize and get much worse. But we can't walk away from this Epstein thing, as much as I'm sure he and his supporters would like.
So recently, DouglasMacgregor went on Stephen Gardner's podcast and talked a little bit about how the Epstein cover-up is spiraling out of control, what the truth is about that story, and why the Trump administration is pivoting to Russiagate right now, and if anything will come from that, including criminal prosecutions. So let's get DouglasMacgregor's take on this. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
I would not expect anything to happen to a former president. I think he'll be largely immunized regardless of what takes place or what transpires. And I don't think that any of us who lived through that era and watched this Russiagate hoax unfold is really surprised by the allegations. But they're still allegations. And before you start talking about putting people in handcuffs and sending them to prison, you've got to look over the evidence and see what is actually there. And as I say, go through this process. Now, having said all of that, it's hard to imagine why this comes out at this particular point in time for any reason other than the desire to distract from the Epstein disaster.
Yeah, I think he's got it totally right there, not only in terms of this being a distraction, and don't get me wrong, there are pertinent and meritorious things that have come through this release and the criminality that was involved in Clapper and Brennan and Comey and Obama, but he's right about presidential immunity. Not only is there, Supreme Court precedent now that says that presidents are immune from criminal proceedings in the execution of their job duties. That had been a long-standing tradition, just kind of that being the end result of that kind of mantra throughout time that happened before Trump. But, Obama's not going to stand trial for this. They're going to dangle these people as criminals out there in front of their base and say, hey, look at this. Look at how these treasonous fools, conspired to try to undermine the presidency, and guess what? We're not going to charge any of them. That doesn't, excuse any of it, but it is meant to be a distraction, not only because of president, and Trump has recently come out and said, hey, Obama has immunity. So I think MacGregor's right.
And I think the Epstein disaster has only just begun. I don't think it's nearing an end. I think it's going to metastasize and get much worse. Because remember that whatever they find in the Epstein files, and I don't know what's in those things, and I'm glad I don't have to look at it, but I'm told that a lot of it involves children. And that's absolutely reprehensible. That is an evil on a scale that we can't even begin to comprehend. So I think that while this current approach is probably justified, how it will unfold is anybody's guess, but I don't see a former president going to jail. At the same time, I think people are still very upset about the Epstein files. I hope that President Trump is not a major figure or a major player and is not implicated in anything that's happened there. I wrote a piece in the American Conservative about it that people may want to look at. It's called Versailles on the Potomac. And I was trying to get people to understand that, and this is difficult for the Washington political class because they think of themselves as invulnerable, invincible, and remote from the population, that they can effectively do whatever they like. Well, that was the problem for the ruling class in France in the lead up to the French Revolution in 1789. And one of the things that really brought down the old regime and led to, the lawlessness and the chaos and the mass murder was the public's utter and complete disgust with the lack of any moral turpitude in the ruling class.
Yeah, that's true about the French Revolution and the events that led up to it, not only in the tennis court oath, but also the storming of the Bastille, etc. DouglasMacgregor is a student of history there. As far as the Epstein files itself, it's hard to really know what exactly is in there. We know that information exists that hasn't been divulged to the public, wire transfer information, evidence withheld from the public in Ghislaine's first trial, search warrant results from the search of Epstein's properties, and that is plural properties, in 2019. And there's a whole host of information that exists that they won't divulge. And he's right, child sex trafficking was part of this operation, and they just want to sweep that stuff under the rug. I think the biggest thing that, a lot of people are missing when talking about this story is the intelligence connections that Epstein had and what information that yields about whether he was an intelligence asset. And I think all the circumstantial evidence points to the fact he was. Not only was he, but that played a role in his arms trafficking pursuits, his Ponzi scheme pursuits, in Towers Financial, and also the blackmail operation that he was conducting to traffic children to prominent people. I just think the evidence points that way. So I'm with Macgregor here, and I guess there are some parallels to the events that preceded the French Revolution.
We need to, and people in Washington need to understand, even though they don't care and they're not interested, most Americans pay tribute to virtue. They honor virtue and they condemn vice. People in Washington are overwhelmingly corrupt and are engaged in all sorts of vice. It's not a question of who as much as it is who isn't, So I think people are underestimating the impact of this Epstein business because there's already a deteriorating faith, not just in President Trump and his failure to do a lot of things in the way that people had hoped, but in the whole system. Democracy itself is on trial in a big way because people are tired of going to the voting booth, discovering that it didn't make much difference who they voted for. They got the same outcome.
Yeah, I entirely agree with this point that the Epstein story, though in isolation, it wouldn't, lead a lot of people to think that that's like the most pertinent issue that's pressing in the United States. I know a lot of people watching this do consider that a pressing issue, but it's emblematic of the Trump rhetoric that said that, hey, he was going to come into Washington and root out the swamp. He would drain the swamp, bring a new era of clarity and transparency. He would be a white knight of sorts that combat these evil globalists that not only tried to undermine him, but hide information from the public, some of which was extremely important. This was a child sex trafficking ring, involving some of the most prominent people in the world. And that's what the victims said about this, that they got trafficked to very prominent people. You've heard all the names thrown out there, but, Alan Dershowitz and Bill Clinton and, Bill Richardson, many people have been accused of this, and people have searched for answers. And Trump came into Washington not with Epstein as the number one platform item for his second term, but many of his subordinates talked about it a lot and made, I've called it quasi-political careers out of talking about this and saying, hey, Trump is the solution here. He's the panacea. He's the antidote to all of this corruption and madness that we've seen in Washington. And that's why I think this is hitting Trump's approval ratings in ways that nothing else has, that no other schism has, no other fallout has, not his rift with Musk, not the Iran war, and not, the spending bills. All of these things, had some impact on him, especially from dissidents and how they have perceived Trump. But among his base, this is the thing that's doing him in. Even not rearming Ukraine seems to have done as much damage as what is being come out of this cover-up.
And that's certainly very true in many respects with President Trump. Now, that's not to say he hasn't tried or whatever, but, the president has never come before the American people and said, this is my strategy. These are the critical things that I want to achieve. And this is how I plan to do it. He's never done it. And the people he's appointed, their preeminent concern is Israel. And they'll tell you, if you ask them, that's ridiculous. Nobody voted for that. So I think all of these problems are coming together. So whatever was done under Obama should be explored, investigated, and if necessary, prosecuted. But I don't think we should shy away from understanding that the Epstein scandal is another greater and even more disturbing event in its own right that we have to address. And I hope President Trump will address it, but it may be too difficult for him. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I generally agree. He's right. On the ballot, it didn't say Israel first, and that was what we were voting for Trump. But if you did do some research, you could see how closely tied into pro-Israel causes and Israel itself Trump was. You know, he received $100 million from Miriam Adelson. Before that, he received hundreds of millions of dollars from Sheldon Adelson. He moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. He signed the Abraham Accords. He really was the most pro-Israel in terms of, if you think pro-Israel is just shoveling money into whatever cause Israel wants, presidents ever. So he's right. Most Americans didn't really perceive that or vote for that. They voted for America first. But they are getting the Israel first connection, and there are connections between that and Epstein because of how many close intelligence assets connections that Epstein had with Israel. With Robert Maxwell, probably Israel's most prominent spy ever. With Adnan Khashoggi, who took care of the Israel side of the Iran-Contra scandal and funneling arms to groups in Iran. From Ehud Barak, who stayed over at his house for prolonged periods of time, you know, visited him 30 times, and Epstein paid him $2.3 million to write 2 essays, one of which he didn't finish. There was obviously money funneling going on between those two as well, with Ari Ben-Banash saying that Epstein told him that he was Israeli intelligence. This is what we are talking about when there are outstanding questions that need answered here.
Yeah. On the one hand, you have President Trump saying, be careful, Democrats are going to use Epstein as a distraction from the Obama story. And Obama's saying, be careful, they're making up this Obama-Russia story to distract you from Epstein. So these two worlds are colliding on which evil is worse. I do believe that Donald Trump is in the Epstein files, but I don't believe that makes him guilty of being with children. Any name could be in there because billionaires rub shoulders. They go to the same racing events, the same gambling places, the same restaurants. They get into places you and I simply can't afford. I can't even afford the tip at some of the places that these people eat. So they do, their circles overlap, but I don't believe. And if I'm wrong on that, I'll be the first one to turn on that and say,
I think, Stephen, you're making a valid point. The problem for President Trump is that his close friendship with Epstein over a period of more than 20 years, perhaps as many as 30, I don't know, certainly 20 to 25, makes this problematic. I mean, there was just too much closeness for too long. And one has to raise the question, well, if you, Mr. Trump, had any idea of what he might have been up to, why did you continue to associate with him? And I think that's going to come up for a question, too. You know, he didn't know at the time that he was going to run for president. Well, that doesn't mean it was a good thing to do. You know, we're again, it's back to what I was saying before. We all know that people are flawed. We're all flawed in some way. That's not open for debate or discussion. But there are some lines you don't cross, some things you don't do. And I think it's important that he be cleared of any wrongdoing in this connection.
Yeah, and I guess he could have done that if he was more forthcoming and he wasn't implicated in crimes. I think it's an incontroversial statement at this point to say his name was in the Epstein files. Of course it was. He was president of the United States. He had a long-term friendship with Epstein. And by the way, the documented evidence shows that it was about 15 years, not 20 or 25. So just putting that caveat out there. And hey, I'm open to, if more information comes out that they are friends for longer than that, fair enough. They certainly had a fallout in 2004, and I haven't seen any evidence that they had connections after that. But yeah, it's true that in the investigation, especially when Trump's the United States, when the second investigation begins in 2019, that Trump's name would appear. You know, from all the people questioned about this, Trump himself participated in the investigation and answered questions. And there's documented evidence to say that, hey, Epstein's lawyers said that, you know, Trump was actually forthcoming in the pursuit of this investigation, actually, and they were involved as well. Not in the same party as Trump, but they were involved as well in that investigation. So yeah, being in the Epstein files, having your name written in any document in whatever files came out of the investigation is not implication of guilt. Now, could Trump be guilty? Maybe he will, but, he's not exactly being forthcoming, so we're just forced to guess. Some people believe that means, yes, for sure he is, or no, for sure he isn't, because, the Democrats would have released this if he was. I think there's kind of merits to both views. Both parties have handled this the same way, but I think the key fact in all this that people are missing is if various people of various political stripes, some of which are close to the Democrats and some of which are close to Trump, are implicated, both sides would be incentivized not to release it. And I think that's likely too. But again, a lot of this gets away from the discussion that a lot of Americans want to hear too, is what were the intelligence connections? And that's what we want to see too. And that's a cause that, goes far above partisan politics and tribalism. So many people are locked into tribalism in talking about this case, but I don't think that's the best route here.
That's as important as it is to bring to light how the bureaucratic apparatus in Washington operates against its unwanted new commander-in-chief, in his case, in 2017, 2018 with the Russia hoax. I think that needs to be brought to light because it's connected to all sorts of people who are still serving right now in the bureaucracy as well as on the Hill. So that deserves to happen. But we can't walk away from this Epstein thing, as much as I'm sure he and his supporters would like.
Yeah, I'm with Macgregor there. We have to keep talking about this case, otherwise there won't ever be transparency for decades, maybe ever, like there wasn't in the JFK case, almost ever. Questions still linger in that, though they have released, I think, almost all the documents that the state had on it. That doesn't give us all information about what happened, but documented, happenstance and documented parts of the investigation were released that had never been released before, and some pertinent stuff did come out of that. I've done other videos on that before. But Macgregor's right. I don't think this Epstein story is really going anywhere. He said it's just begun. I think that might be true. They're trying every strategy under the sun to get away from it. They started to, at the beginning in that press conference, they started to just try to say, hey, that's enough on Epstein. I can't believe you're asking a question about Epstein, when we had this storm in Texas. And comically, he said that, 24 hours after this DOJ and FBI memo, did a complete 180 on their position on Epstein, like they were going to release the Epstein files phase 2 after Binder's Gate. That was a whole nother debacle. And then into a new phase of the gaslighting, they went to, hey, this is Democratic hoax. Even though Democrats wouldn't touch this for 4 years, and Republicans complained and clamored about it for years, saying, hey, there's information you're not divulging about Epstein and his connections and the prominent people associated with Epstein. But the Democrats used Russiagate instead. And then they pivoted to, hey, we're going to Russiagate. Look at these criminals that tried to undermine my presidency. And again, I think there's merit to that. We've covered that too on the channel. And yeah, these people conspired to basically frame the president for treason when there was no evidence that Putin even had a preference in that presidential race. And this played out over years in which Trump was arming Ukraine, sanctioning Russia for, taking Crimea, condemning Russians and the Russian government for allowing Edward Snowden to remain there as an exile. He was particularly bellicose toward Russia, something that most Democrats don't want to admit, and he still is bellicose toward Russia. He's still arming Ukraine, and some of them still pretend that Russiagate, is a real tangible, phenomenon that still plays out today. It's so comical and laughable, you can't maintain it. But here's the problem for them. Number one, they're trying to use it to get away from Epstein. I'm not saying there wasn't anything new of merit in these recent releases, but we knew from the Durham report and other sources that, yeah, this was a hoax from the very beginning. If you paid attention to it, you knew that. The mainstream media just buried the Durham report. So it is a pivot from the Epstein story because Trump was feeling palpable loss of support from the Epstein story. Rasmussen, CNN polls both show that. You can say whatever you want about those polls, but even if you just pay attention to, the difference in issue and their effect on Trump, there's a large gap between, say, the Epstein files and spending. The Epstein story and spending, a lot of Republicans hold more fault toward the president for that. But here's the other thing, is that by creating this new Russiagate release, it's almost setting up for a new Epstein story cover-up, because here's what's going to happen. They're dangling out the criminality of these 4 people, especially Obama, Clapper, Brennan, and Comey, and they're not going to charge any of them. They're not. They're not going to have court dates. There's going to be no indictments, no proceedings, no criminal punishments whatsoever. And this is supposed to still be red meat for the base. Well, again, it's not going to be red meat for the base if these people don't pay, just like Fauci didn't pay. And, he received a pardon from Biden on an auto pen. That's, a topic for another day. But, Obama didn't have that blanket pardon. There's precedent that would protect him. But the other three officials of the deep state, they're not going to go down for this either. And that's a problem for Trump's base, too. At least some of it that, see these theatrics play out with never any tangible effects for the people involved or punishments of them. And I think that's a problem. So I don't know that they can fully pivot away from this Epstein story, even if they could. My mind and my interest still remains on seeking justice, not only for the victims, but actually transparency for people to see what intelligence connections Epstein had. And basically all the circumstantial evidence points in that direction, as I've talked about. So, yeah, I think Macgregor's largely right. I don't think they can necessarily get away from it, and we can't pivot away from it for those of the public that are interested in this. It would be a disservice both to the victims and to, the virtue that is found in a transparent and open society in which most of us want. So that's where I stand on it. Let me know down below. Do you agree with me and Macgregor? Do you agree that this is a pivot away from the Epstein story? Do you think that the Trump administration will get hindered by this and this would jeopardize other parts of his agenda? Let me know in the comments below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Stephen Gardner too. I really appreciated this podcast, this portion of it. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you can support the channel, and in return, I'll give you access to all my videos before they go live on YouTube. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.